October 23, 1944. Palawan Passage, Philippine Islands. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Atago, watching the dark waters ahead as his center force steamed eastward through the narrow strait. Around him sailed the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still muster. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, each displacing 68,000 tons, 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. This was Japan's final gamble. Operation Sho-Go One. The plan was audacious, perhaps desperate. Kurita's force would transit through the central Philippines, punch through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, other Japanese forces would attack from the south, and a carrier force from the north would lure away the American fast carriers. If everything worked perfectly, Japan might deliver a crippling blow to American amphibious forces, and perhaps force negotiations short of total defeat. Kurita knew the odds. He had told his officers before departure, "I know many of you are strongly opposed to this assignment, but the war situation is far more critical than any of you can possibly know. Would it not be a shame to have the fleet remain intact while our nation perishes? You must all remember there are such things as miracles." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Miracles. The word hung in his mind as dawn approached on October 23rd. What Kurita did not know was that 2 American submarines, Data and Dace, had detected his fleet hours earlier and were maneuvering into attack position. At 600 hours, torpedoes struck Atago. The flagship shuddered violently. Within minutes, the ship was sinking. Kurita plunged into the oil-slicked water, swimming desperately as his command vessel disappeared beneath the waves. 2 other heavy cruisers fell victim to the submarine attack. Maya sank almost instantly. Takao, severely damaged, limped away toward safety. Before the Battle of Leyte Gulf had truly begun, Kurita had lost 3 of his 10 heavy cruisers and nearly drowned. This was only the first indication of what awaited Japan's navy. After being rescued and transferring his flag to the battleship Yamato, Kurita pressed eastward. His force entered the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, approaching the narrow strait that would lead them toward Leyte Gulf. Then the American aircraft arrived. Wave after wave of carrier planes struck the Japanese fleet throughout the day. Bombs and torpedoes hammered the ships. The super battleship Musashi, sister to Yamato, and pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, absorbed hit after hit. Torpedoes opened her hull, bombs penetrated her armor. She began listing heavily, her speed dropping as compartments flooded. By evening, Musashi rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The largest battleship ever built, defeated by air power alone. Kurita's force had been savaged. Ships were damaged. Crews were exhausted. Under relentless air attack in the confines of the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita temporarily turned west, appearing to retreat. American commanders believed the center force had been neutralized. This assumption would prove catastrophic. What neither Kurita nor the Americans fully understood yet was that the Battle of Leyte Gulf would reveal the true extent of American industrial and naval supremacy in the starkest possible terms. For Japanese officers who had spent years fighting against material odds, the next 48 hours would shatter every remaining illusion about Japan's chances of victory. The Japanese plan for Operation Sho-Go One was complex, requiring precise coordination across vast distances. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet from headquarters in Tokyo, had designed it as Japan's last roll of the dice. The plan divided Japanese naval forces into 4 groups, each with specific missions meant to overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The Northern Force, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, consisted of 4 aircraft carriers with few planes or trained pilots aboard. Ozawa's mission was purely sacrificial: sail toward the Americans, attract attention, draw away the powerful American fast carrier task forces. He knew his ships were likely doomed. After the devastating losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, Japan lacked pilots and aircraft to properly equip carriers. Ozawa's ships were essentially floating decoys. The southern force, split into two groups under Vice Admirals Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima, would approach Leyte Gulf from the south through Surigao Strait. This force included 2 battleships and several cruisers. Like Ozawa's carriers, this force was expected to draw American attention, pulling ships away from Kurita's primary attack. Kurita's center force remained the main striking element. If the diversions worked, if Ozawa's carriers drew away the American fast battleships and fleet carriers, if Nishimura's ships occupied the 7th Fleet's attention in the south, then Kurita's battleships and cruisers could enter Leyte Gulf relatively unopposed. There they would find the soft targets: transport ships, supply vessels, landing craft supporting General Douglas MacArthur's invasion of Leyte Island. The plan required luck, timing, and the Americans making mistakes. In the early hours of October 25th, after the savage air attacks of the previous day, Kurita reversed course again. His damaged force steamed east once more, this time successfully transiting the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. The strait was unguarded. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, had taken the bait. Believing Kurita's force was retreating and unable to resist the opportunity to destroy Japanese carriers, Halsey had committed his entire force, including the fast battleships, to chase Ozawa's northern force. Kurita emerged from San Bernardino Strait and turned south along the coast of Samar Island. Ahead lay Leyte Gulf. The way appeared clear, but what Kurita and his officers were about to witness would begin destroying their last hopes for anything resembling victory. As dawn broke on October 25th, lookouts aboard Kurita's ships spotted masts on the horizon. Small ships. Aircraft carriers. The Americans had left a screen of escort carriers and destroyers, presumably to provide air support for troops ashore. These were not the massive fleet carriers Kurita had hoped to avoid. These were tiny escort carriers, each displacing less than 8,000 tons, carrying perhaps 24 aircraft, capable of barely 20 knots maximum speed. These small carriers, designated Task Unit 77.4.3, but known by their radio call sign Taffy 3, represented a trivial obstacle to Kurita's force. Yamato alone outweighed all 6 escort carriers combined. The battleship's 18-inch guns could destroy these fragile ships from beyond their effective range. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, was stunned when his lookouts reported Japanese battleships approaching at high speed. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, anti-submarine vessels and convoy protection ships. They had not been designed or equipped to fight battleships. Sprague immediately ordered his carriers to run east, into the wind, launching aircraft as fast as possible. The destroyers and destroyer escorts turned toward the Japanese fleet, prepared to sacrifice themselves in torpedo attacks to buy time. It should have been a slaughter. Yet, as the battle developed through the morning of October 25th, something happened that would haunt Japanese survivors for the rest of their lives. The small American ships fought with such ferocity, such determination, such apparently inexhaustible resources, that the battle outcome defied all logical expectations. The American destroyers charged directly at Kurita's battleships and cruisers. They launched torpedoes, fired guns, created smoke screens, zigzagged through Japanese formations. The destroyer USS Johnston, struck repeatedly by heavy shells, continued attacking until she sank. The destroyer USS Hoel absorbed dozens of hits while pressing torpedo attacks. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, armed with guns barely adequate against destroyer targets, engaged heavy cruisers at close range before being blown apart. The escort carriers themselves, built on merchant ship hulls and armed with a single 5-inch gun, maneuvered desperately while their aircraft made repeated attacks. Some aircraft dropped bombs and torpedoes. Others, having expended their weapons, made dry runs over Japanese ships, hoping to distract gun crews and buy time. Pilots used depth charges, meant for submarines, against armored warships. They strafed with machine guns that could barely penetrate deck plating. But it was not the tactical details of the engagement that would deliver the psychological blow to Japanese officers. It was what they saw as the battle progressed. What they witnessed would crystallize years of mounting evidence into an undeniable conclusion. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, stood beside the admiral on Yamato's bridge throughout the battle. The confusion was immense. Poor visibility from smoke and rain squalls, no air reconnaissance, conflicting reports from various ships, constant air attacks. But through the chaos, one fact became increasingly, horrifyingly clear. The Americans had more ships than intelligence reports had suggested, far more. As Japanese lookouts reported targets, as radar operators tracked contacts, as the battle spread across miles of ocean, the number of American vessels seemed to multiply beyond reason. Taffy 3 was not alone. As American carriers called for help, other groups responded. Taffy 2 and Taffy 1, positioned further south, launched their aircraft northward. More escort carriers, more destroyers, more aircraft. The sky filled with American planes. Then reports arrived from scouts. Further to the east, over the horizon, more ships. Larger ships. The reports were fragmentary, confused by the chaos of battle, but they suggested American fleet carriers and battleships approaching. Was the Third Fleet returning? How many ships did the Americans have? For Kurita and his officers, staring at the evidence before them, the answer was becoming terrifyingly apparent. Too many. Always too many. More than Japan could ever match. More than made any strategic sense. An inexhaustible supply that replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. This was not new information, intellectually. Japanese planners had known American production statistics for years. They had seen intelligence reports. They had tracked American naval expansion. But knowing numbers abstractly and witnessing the concrete reality of American material superiority were entirely different experiences. One Japanese officer later recalled the moment of realization. We could see carriers everywhere, small ones, yes, but so many. And they kept launching aircraft. We would shoot down planes, and more would appear. We would damage ships, and others would take their place. It was like trying to fight the ocean itself. The battle off Samar lasted roughly 3 hours. By 09:30, despite having sunk one escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort, despite having damaged other vessels, despite having the overwhelming advantage in firepower, Kurita ordered his force to disengage. He turned his ships north, away from Leyte Gulf, away from the vulnerable transport ships that were his mission objective. Historians have debated Kurita's decision for decades. He faced contradictory information. His force was scattered. Communications were poor. Aircraft were attacking continuously. He believed, wrongly, that he faced fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. He feared that Halsey's fast battleships were approaching and would trap him. He was exhausted, having been in combat or under air attack for 3 days straight. But underlying all tactical considerations was a deeper truth that Kurita and his officers were beginning to comprehend. Even if they reached Leyte Gulf, even if they destroyed the transports there, even if they achieved a tactical victory in this one battle, it would not matter, because the Americans would simply bring more ships, more aircraft, more supplies, always more. Kurita's center force retreated westward through San Bernardino Strait. They had failed to reach their primary objective. They had lost 3 heavy cruisers to submarines on October 23rd. They had lost the super battleship Musashi to air attack on October 24th. During the battle off Samar, they had lost 3 more heavy cruisers. Half of Kurita's cruiser force was gone. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not over. While Kurita fought off Samar, other actions unfolded across hundreds of miles of ocean. The true scope of American naval power was about to be revealed. To the south, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's force of battleships and cruisers had been waiting in Surigao Strait throughout the night of October 24th to 25th. When Nishimura's southern force attempted to force the strait, they sailed into a perfectly executed ambush. American battleships, including several that had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor and subsequently raised and repaired, crossed the T. This classic naval maneuver allowed all American guns to bear, while Japanese ships could only fire forward weapons. The bombardment was devastating. Both Japanese battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, were sunk. The heavy cruiser Mogami was crippled and later scuttled. Multiple destroyers were destroyed. The Battle of Surigao Strait lasted only a few hours. It was the last time in history that battleships would engage each other in combat. It was a complete American victory. The second part of the Southern Force, under Vice Admiral Shima, arrived at Surigao Strait after Nishimura's force had already been destroyed. Seeing the burning wrecks and facing overwhelming American firepower, Shima wisely chose to retreat rather than add his ships to the carnage. To the north, far from the carnage at Surigao Strait and the desperate struggle off Samar, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was accomplishing exactly what the Japanese had intended. They were destroying Ozawa's carrier force. Halsey had taken the bait completely. When American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Japanese carriers northeast of Luzon on the afternoon of October 24th, Halsey committed his entire force to their destruction. Task Force 38, containing 15 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, steamed north through the night. At dawn on October 25th, American carrier aircraft launched against Ozawa's northern force. The Japanese had 4 carriers: Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. But as American pilots quickly discovered, these carriers posed minimal threat. They carried few aircraft. The pilots they did have were poorly trained replacements for the experienced aviators lost at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ozawa's force could barely defend itself. American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked in waves throughout October 25th. One by one, the Japanese carriers were struck, set ablaze, and sent to the bottom. Zuikaku, which had participated in every major carrier battle from Pearl Harbor through the Philippine Sea, took multiple torpedo hits and sank in the afternoon. Zuiho went down after absorbing bombs and torpedoes. Chitose and Chiyoda were both destroyed. By day's end, all 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. Ozawa had accomplished his mission perfectly. He had drawn away the American fast carriers and battleships. He had opened the path for Kurita to reach Leyte Gulf. His ships had been sacrificed as planned. But the sacrifice proved meaningless because Kurita had turned back. The elaborate Japanese plan had failed at the critical moment. For Japanese officers analyzing the battle afterward, the statistics from Cape Engano provided another crushing data point. Japan had committed 4 carriers to the northern force. All 4 were sunk. The Americans deployed more than 20 carriers in the overall battle. None were lost. Not one. The mathematical disparity was so stark, it defied traditional naval thinking. As October 26th dawned, the Battle of Leyte Gulf entered its final phase. Kurita's battered center force was retreating westward. The southern force had been annihilated. The northern force was destroyed. Japanese naval aviation made desperate kamikaze attacks against American ships in Leyte Gulf, introducing organized suicide tactics for the first time. These attacks achieved some success, sinking the escort carrier USS Street Low and damaging other vessels. But kamikaze attacks, horrifying as they were, could not change the fundamental equation. When American commanders tallied the results, the victory was overwhelming. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and approximately 10,000 sailors and aviators. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and approximately 2,800 men. More critically, Japan lost ships it could not replace. America lost ships that were already being replaced faster than Japan could sink them. The true shock for surviving Japanese officers came not during the battle itself, but in the weeks and months afterward as the full scope of American naval strength became undeniable. Intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and simple observation revealed statistics that seemed impossible, yet were verified repeatedly. Admiral Toyoda, who had ordered Operation Sho-Go One from his headquarters in Tokyo, received comprehensive after-action reports. The numbers told a story of complete industrial defeat. Vice Admiral Kurita, in his post-battle debriefing, described what his officers had witnessed. Not just a battle, but a glimpse of American production capacity made manifest in steel and aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics that emerged painted a picture of disparity so vast it challenged comprehension. During the war, Japan constructed 6 fleet carriers after the Battle of Midway in June 1942. In the same period, the United States commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers built on cruiser hulls, and dozens of escort carriers, 122 carriers of all types. The Essex-class carriers themselves represented an achievement Japanese industry could not match. Each displaced approximately 27,000 tons, each carried more than 90 aircraft, each required millions of man-hours to construct, incorporating advanced technology including radar, fire control computers, and complex damage control systems. Yet American shipyards launched these massive vessels at a pace of approximately 1 every 6 weeks at peak production. Japanese officers studying these figures understood the implications. The USS Essex, first of the class, was laid down in April 1941, launched in July 1942, and commissioned in December 1942, less than 2 years from keel laying to combat readiness. Some Essex-class carriers were built even faster. The USS Shangri-La took 29 months from start to commissioning. Japanese carriers took 4 to 5 years to build in the best circumstances. The supercarrier, Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, took years of work and was sunk by a single submarine 10 days after leaving port, having never embarked a full air group. The Americans barely noticed its loss. By late 1944, the United States had so many carriers that losing one had negligible strategic impact. The destroyer statistics were equally crushing. The Fletcher-class destroyer, backbone of the American destroyer force, saw 175 ships built in 32 months by 11 different shipyards. That represented more than 1 destroyer per week. Japan, struggling with resource shortages and damaged shipyards, managed approximately 165,000 trucks during the entire war. America built 2 million. The numbers extended across every category of naval construction: battleships, cruisers, submarines, amphibious vessels, supply ships, repair ships. The United States constructed more than 6,800 naval vessels during the war. By VJ Day in August 1945, the U.S. Navy operated 28 aircraft carriers, 23 battleships, 71 escort carriers, 72 cruisers, more than 232 submarines, and 377 destroyers. For comparison, Japan entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. The combined fleet at its peak could muster approximately 10 carriers, 12 battleships, and 50 cruisers and destroyers combined. By late 1944, after Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed insufficient ships to conduct fleet operations. But the shock extended beyond simple ship counts. It was the speed of replacement that devastated Japanese strategic planning. American shipyards employed entire cities. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, Mare Island, Newport News, and other facilities ran 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Women entered heavy industrial work in massive numbers. Families moved to temporary housing near shipyards. By 1943, more than 2 million Americans worked directly in shipbuilding. The Americans had not just built ships, they had built entire shipbuilding industries from nearly nothing. New yards appeared across the country. Henry Kaiser's yards on the West Coast, which had never built warships before the war, pioneered mass production techniques including prefabrication and welding that accelerated construction. The Maritime Commission built new yards specifically for cargo ship production. Japanese industry could not match this expansion. Resource shortages limited steel production. American submarines attacked shipping, cutting Japan off from raw materials in conquered territories. Strategic bombing damaged shipyards and factories. Labor shortages grew acute as men were drafted into the military. By 1944, Japanese industrial output was declining while American production continued accelerating. Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer captains, survived the war and wrote extensively about the growing realization of defeat. In his memoir, he described returning to port after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 and seeing damaged Japanese ships waiting months for repair. Meanwhile, he wrote, "Intelligence reported that Americans were repairing battle damage in weeks and launching new ships constantly. We understood then that we were fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than we could inflict them." The Battle of Leyte Gulf crystallized this understanding across the Japanese officer corps. Those who witnessed it, who saw the endless American ships and aircraft, who experienced the relentless material pressure, understood that Japan had lost the naval war, not because of tactical failures or lack of courage, but because of industrial mathematics that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. Admiral Kurita's controversial decision to withdraw from Leyte Gulf made more sense viewed through this lens. Even if he had destroyed every transport ship in Leyte Gulf, even if he had inflicted maximum casualties, the Americans would have returned. They would have brought more troops, more ships, more supplies. The mathematical inevitability of defeat was already written. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda faced the bitter task of reporting to Imperial General Headquarters. The combined fleet, Japan's primary instrument of naval power for decades, had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Individual ships remained, but the fleet could not sail in strength. Fuel shortages, combined with ship losses, meant remaining vessels stayed in port. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. Some officers had warned against war with America from the beginning, understanding the production disparity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, killed in 1943, had famously cautioned that Japan might fight successfully for 6 months, but could not win a protracted war. His warnings proved prophetic. Other officers had convinced themselves that fighting spirit, tactical excellence, and American unwillingness to endure casualties would compensate for material disadvantage. By late 1944, after Leyte Gulf, this delusion could no longer be sustained. The Americans had demonstrated both superior material resources and the will to use them. Post-war interrogations revealed the extent of Japanese knowledge about American production. Intelligence reports had provided accurate statistics about shipbuilding, aircraft production, and industrial capacity. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was refusal to accept the implications. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit over matter. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that moral superiority and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. Bushido traditions reinforced this thinking. Individual acts of heroism abounded throughout the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers and sailors fought with extraordinary courage against impossible odds. But courage could not build ships. Sacrifice could not conjure aircraft. Fighting spirit could not extract oil from empty fields or produce steel from depleted mines. The material foundations of modern war required industrial capacity, and Japan simply did not possess it at the necessary scale. Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, was forced to resign in July 1944 after the loss of the Marianas. His testimony at war crimes trials revealed the extent of strategic miscalculation. "We did not adequately understand the American potential," he admitted. "We believed their will to fight would break before their industrial power could be fully mobilized. We were wrong." Vice Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Navy Minister at various times, told interrogators that Japanese naval officers had warned civilian leaders that war with America was unwinnable. These warnings were ignored by Army leaders who controlled government policy. The Army believed that quick victories would force a negotiated peace before American industrial might become decisive. Pearl Harbor had been designed to buy time for this strategy. Sink the American battleships, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, create a defensive perimeter too costly for America to overcome, force negotiations, secure Japan's conquests. But every premise of this strategy proved false. The battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor were repaired or replaced. The territories seized by Japan could not be adequately defended with Japan's limited resources. The defensive perimeter was penetrated repeatedly as American forces island-hopped across the Pacific. Most critically, America demonstrated not weakness of will, but fierce determination to achieve total victory. American industrial mobilization exceeded even optimistic Japanese estimates. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's production goals, announced shortly after Pearl Harbor, seemed fantastic. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, increasing to 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks. These targets were met and exceeded. By 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan built during the entire war. The contrast with Japanese production was stark. In 1944, Japanese aircraft production peaked at approximately 28,000 planes annually. American production that year exceeded 90,000. Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total from 1939 to 1945. America produced approximately 297,000. These production differentials translated directly into combat capability. American pilots flew better aircraft in greater numbers. They received superior training. They had adequate fuel for practice. Japanese pilots, increasingly, were rushed into combat with minimal preparation. By late war, Japanese aviation training programs were producing pilots with a fraction of the flight hours American pilots received. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, described watching the quality of Japanese pilots deteriorate as the war progressed. In his autobiography, Samurai, published in 1957, he wrote, "They were slaughtered. They never had a chance." By 1944, we veteran pilots knew we were losing. We could see the quality of American aircraft improving while ours stagnated. We could see the numbers of American planes increasing while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no choice. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified through 1945 as B-29 Superfortress bombers, operating from bases in the Marianas, systematically destroyed Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. 66 other cities suffered similar attacks. Japanese urban industrial capacity was progressively annihilated, yet even this destruction did not immediately produce surrender. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting to national extinction, refused to accept defeat. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally above political decisions, became increasingly concerned as the true situation became clear. But cultural and political constraints prevented him from directly ordering surrender until after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. For Japanese naval officers, the end came not with dramatic battles, but with quiet acknowledgement of defeat. The few major warships that survived Leyte Gulf and subsequent operations sat in port, immobilized by fuel shortages. The super battleship Yamato made one final sortie in April 1945 as part of Operation Ten-Go, a suicide mission to beach itself on Okinawa and serve as a stationary artillery platform. American carrier aircraft intercepted and sank Yamato long before she reached the island. The most powerful battleship ever built went down under overwhelming air attack, a fitting symbol of Japan's defeat. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, most Japanese were shocked. Government propaganda had maintained that Japan was winning until the very end. The emperor's radio address, the first time most Japanese had heard his voice, explained that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The careful phrasing could not disguise the reality of complete defeat. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, oversaw Japan's occupation. American forces arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that stunned Japanese civilians who had been living with severe shortages. For years, government propaganda had described Americans as weak and decadent. Japanese civilians now saw American soldiers with abundant food, advanced equipment, and casual confidence of those who had won decisively. For Japanese military officers, post-war interrogations forced painful acknowledgement of their failures. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with Japanese commanders, gathering information about strategic decisions, intelligence capabilities, and industrial capacity. The data compiled revealed systematic Japanese underestimation of American power across every dimension. Japanese planners had known American production statistics intellectually. They had seen intelligence reports. They had tracked American naval expansion. But they had failed to grasp the implications until confronted with undeniable physical evidence. The ships kept coming. The aircraft kept appearing. The supplies never ran out. Fighting the American military was like fighting an avalanche. Courage meant nothing against material inevitability. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs, "We understood American material superiority intellectually, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally. We believed spirit could overcome matter. This was our fundamental error." Several Japanese officers noted in memoirs and interviews that witnessing American material abundance changed their understanding of power and prosperity. Japan had gone to war partly to secure resources and living space. The belief was that military conquest could provide what Japan's limited territory and resources could not. But post-war reconstruction, guided by American occupation authorities, demonstrated that peaceful trade and industrial development could achieve far greater prosperity than military conquest ever had. Modern Japan, rebuilding from complete devastation, eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. This success came through the very industrial development and international trade that militarists in the 1930s had rejected in favor of expansion and war. The resources Japanese planners sought to control through conquest were ultimately obtained through peaceful commerce. But in October 1944, as Vice Admiral Kurita's battered center force retreated westward from Leyte Gulf, these future developments were unimaginable. What Kurita and his officers knew, with absolute certainty, was that they had witnessed something that shattered their last illusions about the war's possible outcome. They had seen 100 American warships, perhaps more. The reports were confused, the battle chaotic, but the scale was undeniable. Carriers launching aircraft continuously, destroyers attacking with seemingly reckless courage because they could be replaced. Escort carriers, the Americans' throwaway auxiliary vessels, fighting with determination because dozens more existed beyond the horizon, 100 ships, at Leyte Gulf alone, and intelligence reported that this represented only a fraction of American naval strength. More carriers prowled the Pacific, more battleships guarded other sectors, more destroyers escorted convoys, more ships were being built, always more ships. The Battle of Leyte Gulf involved approximately 282 vessels total, including both American and Japanese forces. Of these, 218 were American or Allied. Japan committed 64 ships and lost 29, nearly half its force. This disparity, this brutal arithmetic of industrial war, could not be rationalized away. For individual Japanese sailors and officers who survived the battle, the memories remained vivid decades later. In interviews conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, elderly veterans recalled specific moments of realization. One radar operator remembered tracking American contacts and watching the screen fill with more targets than his equipment could properly display. A lookout described seeing carrier after carrier on the horizon and understanding that Japan could never build so many. A gunnery officer recalled shooting down American aircraft and watching more appear immediately, an endless stream. The psychological blow was not just recognizing American strength, it was understanding that Japan's leaders had sent them into an unwinnable war with incomplete understanding of the enemy's true power. The courage of Japanese fighting men had been real, the sacrifice had been genuine. But the strategic calculations that led to war had been catastrophically wrong. In the decades after the war, as historians compiled statistics and interviewed survivors, the full scope of American naval production became documented with precision. During World War II, the United States built 9,000 war vessels, not including landing craft and small boats. This exceeded the combined production of all other nations. American shipyards employed industrial techniques, including prefabrication and welding, that revolutionized ship construction. The Liberty ships, standard cargo vessels, were built in an average of 42 days by 1943. Some were completed in less than 2 weeks from keel laying to launch. This represented a complete transformation of ship construction, applying assembly line principles to vessels displacing 10,000 tons. Japan built nothing comparable. The escort carriers, which Japanese officers encountered in such numbers at Leyte Gulf, were built on merchant hulls in yards that had never constructed warships before the war. They were slow, lightly armed, and vulnerable compared to fleet carriers. But they appeared in massive numbers, 122 total, and they worked. They provided air cover for convoys, supported amphibious landings, and proved impossible for Japan to counter. The strategic implications were overwhelming. Even if Japanese forces had achieved greater tactical success at Leyte Gulf, even if they had sunk more American ships, the mathematical disparity ensured eventual defeat. America could absorb losses and continue. Japan could not. Every ship Japan lost was irreplaceable. Every ship America lost was already being replaced. This was the fundamental truth that Japanese officers finally, irrevocably understood as they witnessed the American fleet at Leyte Gulf. The war was lost, not because of cowardice or poor tactics or lack of will, but because of industrial capacity so vast that it rendered traditional naval combat equations meaningless. The Pacific War would continue for another 9 months after Leyte Gulf. Japanese forces fought with desperate courage at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless smaller battles. Kamikaze attacks intensified, reflecting the military's turn to suicide tactics as conventional defense became impossible. But the outcome was never in doubt after October 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, which had fielded some of the finest ships and best-trained aviators in the world, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after Leyte Gulf. The remaining vessels stayed in port, stranded by fuel shortages and irreplaceable losses. When they did sortie, as Yamato did in April 1945, it was for suicide missions rather than strategic objectives. For the officers who had witnessed 100 American warships at Leyte Gulf, who had seen the carriers and destroyers and cruisers stretching to the horizon, who had understood in that moment the true scale of American power, the memory never faded. They had seen the future of warfare. They had witnessed industrial capacity as a decisive weapon. They had learned that in modern war, production determined outcomes as surely as tactics or courage. The lesson was expensive. Approximately 2.8 million Japanese military personnel died in World War II. Between 500,000 and 1 million civilians died from bombing, starvation, and war-related causes. These casualties occurred in a war Japanese leaders initiated while understanding, at some level, that victory was impossible if America fully mobilized. Admiral Yamamoto had understood from the beginning. His warnings went unheeded. Vice Admiral Kurita understood after Leyte Gulf, when he withdrew his forces despite having tactical advantage, knowing that victory in one battle meant nothing against inexhaustible American strength. Eventually, all Japanese officers understood, but by then, understanding came too late to prevent catastrophe. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended Japan's capacity to conduct naval operations. More profoundly, it destroyed the last illusions about Japan's chances in the war. For the officers who were there, who saw the American ships, who witnessed industrial supremacy made manifest in steel and aircraft and endless supplies, October 1944 marked the moment when hope died and reality became undeniable. 100 warships, perhaps more, at a single battle, with more beyond the horizon, always more, an industrial tide that could not be turned by courage or sacrifice or tactical brilliance. The Japanese officers understood, finally and completely, that the Pacific was lost. The war was lost. The only question remaining was how much more destruction Japan would endure before accepting the inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.